All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Really happy to have you joining us. Over the last couple of months, I've really enjoyed hosting a series of presentations where we featured some really special artists and their contributions to conservation. But tonight, I'm really excited to learn about a native animal that evokes strong feelings from fear and mystery to awe and reverence, and one that has been persecuted for the last 150 years of European occupation of the Western United States. Before we get started, I'll briefly introduce myself, our speaker, and tonight's plan. So my name is Rob Clavins. I'm the Northeast Oregon Field Coordinator for Oregon Wild. I'm based in rural Wallowa County, where my wife and I have a working farm and bed and breakfast near Enterprise, not far from Oregon's last known grizzly. And tonight I am excited to welcome Ethan Shaw. Ethan is a naturalist, a researcher, and writer based just around the mountains from me and Cove, which is near the town of LeGrand. Ethan gave a talk for us on bison and grizzly a few years ago, but today we're going to be going uh, deep on the big bear. And I realize now I forgot to start my slideshow. Silly me. So let me just actually pull that up real quickly. Sorry about that. Okay. Hopefully you can see that. Ethan, can you see that? Great. Well, because my next slide is the real reason I wanted to make sure we got that. Like Ethan, like me, Ethan is originally from Wisconsin. So even if we like some bears, we actively cheer against the ones from Chicago. We got our start exploring the swamps, the prairies, and deciduous forests of the Midwest, but swapped that for mountains, canyons, wide open spaces, and wild rivers. I won't read off a formal land acknowledgement tonight, but I do want to just note that we chose to make this our home because it's such an amazing place, but we're far from the first. People have been living here for no less than 16,000 years, and settlers with my complexion not only persecuted, murdered, and drove off wildlife like grizzly bears, elk, and jackrabbits, we did the same to the Nez Perce and other indigenous people. But they persisted, they're still here, and they deserve to be heard. Ethan and I are going to share our perspectives, but they're just two among many, and there are lots of ways of knowing. And speaking of different perspectives, anytime we address a topic that can be polarizing, we expect to have some folks who don't want to see the return of native peoples or wildlife, who might prefer dammed rivers to free-flowing rivers, or monocultures to messy, self-willed forests. Others may view coexisting with native wildlife as a burden rather than a responsibility. So I want to note right up front that Oregon Wild does not have a grizzly bear campaign. We're not aware of any efforts by the United Nations or any government to reintroduce grizzly bears to Oregon. And we don't have any interns stuffing wolves and bears into trailers and dispersing them around the state. But it is almost April Fool's Day, so be sure to look at your calendars if you hear of such plans. We're simply here to learn about a native species that's been persecuted but continues to hold on and is right on our doorstep. We do have a great turnout tonight, so for new folks, I just want to briefly let you know what to expect. Following Ethan's presentation, I'll give some brief comments about our work, and then we'll dive right into a question and answer session. We often get a flood of questions right at the end, and that can be challenging to manage. So please submit your questions as they come up for you throughout the presentation in the Q&A box. We almost always run out of time, so the sooner you get them in, the easier it is for us to organize, respond, and more likely that they'll be answered. This webcast is being recorded. The video will be posted on our YouTube channel and website. And as soon as it's posted, we'll share a link with everybody who's signed up. But due to spring break, we're a little bit understaffed this week, so it might take a little longer than normal. Thanks also to everybody who purchased a raffle ticket and all of our members. Your support allows us to host presentations like this and continue our secret Sasquatch and grizzly bear dispersal program. I mean, our mission to advocate for waters, wildlife, and the wild places that make Oregon such a special place. Raffle winners will be randomly selected tomorrow and contacted by email to verify your shipping address. And for new folks, I just want to very briefly share who we are. Oregon Wild is a statewide member-based conservation organization. We celebrated our 50th anniversary in 2024, and we're founded to coordinate with communities around the state to protect our waters, wildlife, and waters as an enduring legacy for future generations. Though we've grown in recent years, we remain a grassroots organization and rely on individuals to support us with your dollars, but also with your voice. So that's enough for me for now. I'm really glad to hand things off to my friend and neighbor, Ethan Shaw.
Thanks, Rob.
You
Can you
bet.
hear me? Okay.
Yep. We're good.
Excellent. Thanks for that Chicago Bears reference too. Jeez. Um, yep, I'm a fellow Packers fan. I'm gonna start my screen sharing and get going here. Give me 1 second, and I will do that. So, yes, thank you, Rob, and thanks also to Oregon Wild for having me. And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight to talk about a pretty cool critter. This is a really masterfully doctored image. I'm being sarcastic that I made of basically the Hells Canyon country out here in Northeast Oregon, and I took the liberty of dropping some a Yellowstone grizzly family into the foreground, just to sort of remind us what this area and much of Oregon might have looked like, or a scene you might have encountered in, say, I don't know, 1700 or 1800, or going farther back. So this is going to be basically a historical presentation, and some speculative historical ecology musings about not only where grizzlies were in Oregon, but so what they might have been doing on the landscape. At the end, I'll do a quick kind of sort of painting the picture of where grizzlies are at now in the lower 48 states, and it's a complicated issue, but we'll kind of close with that. And I don't claim to be an expert on grizzly policy, but that'll be the kind of close to this talk. So there we go. As Rob said, with the Indigenous acknowledgement, this story that I'm going to, share tonight is quite incomplete, is very incomplete, very fractured. I don't claim to be the authority on the subject, and I certainly am not the authority on the Indigenous perspective and traditional knowledge concerning grizzly bears, because after all, Native peoples have the deepest connection and relationship with the bear in our what became Oregon. Euro-Americans and grizzly bears had a pretty brief overlap period when you think about the big scheme of things. So this Cayuse Nez Perce, also out here in Northeast Oregon in the Baker Valley, kind of gestures at that relationship. There are many indigenous toponyms or place names concerning grizzlies, some of which give us even some clues into historical grizzly lifeways. So again, indigenous knowledge has to be a part of really understanding the story of the grizzly bear in Oregon, certainly any future story of the bear. To kind of drive home that point even more, there is a widely kind of documented Malala story that actually connects Oregon's tallest peak with the grizzly bear, and a tale about coyote encountering grizzly bear, doing some trickery and ending up bear dying, cutting up this in the grizzly bear heart into the Malala homeland and country. So it's sort of fitting out that at cultural mythological associating the tallest peak in Oregon and the largest native terrestrial carnivore in the state. A really quick introduction. I'm sure many of you are familiar with what a grizzly bear is. Grizzly bear is a subspecies of brown bear. It's the most widespread of the two formerly recognized North American subspecies of brown bear. The brown bear is across a enormous range, certainly historically speaking, in Eurasia and North America. Also down into North Africa in the Atlas Mountains, where brown bears used to exist, and no longer. Incredibly versatile, adaptable, opportunistic omnivore that came to North America, we reckon, on the order of 50,000 to 70,000 years ago in the late Pleistocene, part of a number of sort of a guild of different megafaunal species like elk and bison that made that journey with the lower sea levels during glacial periods. So been around a long time, and there's a very fascinating, I mean, the taxonomy and the evolutionary coming of being of the grizzly bear in North America is pretty amazing. I'll skip it in the interest of time, but worth noting that when grizzly bears arrived, when brown bears arrived in North America, they weren't necessarily the top dog. There was quite an impressive lineup of other big carnivores like giant short-faced bears and American lions they were competing with and possibly being predated upon by. And the Etruscan bear here is simply that's a widely recognized as probably the direct ancestor of the brown bear. This is a quick. I'll try to summarize this very quickly. But speaking of that brown bear arrival in North America, these are maps by a researcher Matson who studied grizzly bears for many decades, both for the federal government as an independent scientist, and did a lot of amazing work reconstructing sort of the historical distribution and ecology of grizzlies. A lot of what I'm going to kind of share tonight is directly or partly coming from his work, and I'll share some of the websites where that comes from. I encourage you to check it out for a much deeper dive. I'm sharing these maps by David Matson simply to emphasize that, brown bears appear to have colonized North America like some of the other species in waves. And one of the early waves is what taxonomists have identified as clade 4. Clade is just a term for a group of organisms within the same species that share a common ancestor. So clade 4 came over maybe 20, 30,000 some years ago, colonized the sort of more southerly part of North America. And then because of the advances of the ice sheets, the coalescing of the continental ice sheets during the last glacial maximum in the Pleistocene, were isolated from others that were coming over. And so the take-home message, basically, roughly speaking, is that all the grizzly bears, as we understand it in the lower 48 and this part of southern Canada, descend from this unique lineage of bears. There's some admixture going up in the Canadian Rockies, but Oregon's grizzlies were these clade 4 bears, and this is a map showing their original distribution, and then the green depicts where they're found today. So it's actually sort of a unique and restricted genetic line of grizzly bears that kind of is at this point not particularly numerous, but those are the bears that inhabited. So in historical times, kind of zooming ahead, here's another David Matson map showing the likely historical distribution of grizzly bears in North America. And you can see that much of northwestern and western North America was grizzly bear country, including Oregon down here. So very widespread. These question marks reference sort of this topic of why grizzlies weren't, in historical times anyway, more found in eastern North America. And that's a topic that if we want to get into in the Q&A, we can address. It doesn't particularly pertain to Oregon, though, so I'll pass it over. But just to say that in Eurasia, brown bears are widely found in sort of the eastern temperate hardwood forests that are dominating this part of the continent. But here's where we were standing in historical times in terms of grizzly bear country. This is a more zoom again historical map from Vernon Bailey's kind of classic mammals and life zones of Oregon, um, depicting uh, likely historical grizzly bear distributions. It's probably roughly accurate, not completely. We know that grizzlies were found on the southwest Oregon coast in sort of the maritime Klamaths, which is not shown here. The question of whether grizzlies were found farther north up the coast is a little bit unsettled, uh, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But in broad strokes, this shows some of the main grizzly strongholds in historical times in the state. You know, the Cascades, the Klamaths, Klamath Siskiyous, the Willamette Valley, and then out here in northeast Oregon, the Blue Mountain Province, and then surprisingly to a lot of people, it seems grizzlies did inhabit Steens Mountain, some other parts of southeastern Oregon, including the Oahe Mountains. So kind of on the far northern outskirts of the northern Great Basin. These numbers refer to uh, at the time when this was published. These these were thought to be different distinct species of grizzly bears, which is based on a C.H. Merriam's 1918 taxonomy of brown bears in North America, which declared, you know, dozens of brown bear species on the continent. Suffice to say, we don't consider that valid any longer. He was definitely a taxonomic splitter, but I think that there is maybe some value into looking at that sort of historical record because his work was based mainly on skull characteristics of brown bears, and maybe the insights, maybe there are insights into you know, kind of different ecotypes of grizzly bears, all the same species, all brown bears, but possibly sort of tuned into particular ecological landscapes or ecoregions. So the question of whether grizzlies were found on the Oregon coast, at least north of southwestern Oregon, where we have bone records of bears in southwestern Oregon in the maritime zone. There's not, you know, this sort of speaks to the limitations of the Euro-American record. We don't have a lot of records from that time period of grizzlies on the immediate Oregon coast. This quote I have here from a French Canadian fella who spent several years at Fort Astoria in the early 1810s. He does reference, as you can read, he actually refers to four species of bears: black, brown, white, and grizzly bear. Again, kind of a reflection of that time when we tended to take different pelage characteristics or just body size, and declare different populations of bears, different species. Anyhow, this is a suggestion that perhaps grizzlies were found to some degree in the lower Columbia country. The white bear reference here that's a common one you'll see in early Euro-American records, including Lurk, sort of a synonym for the grizzly bear. This, you know, in his reckoning, it was two different bears. But so whether there were it was simply that. I mean, it's the Oregon coast and coast range would seem to be favorable habitat for grizzlies, certainly similar to what they inhabited in California, northwestern California, similar seasonal temperate rainforest, similar to the kinds of ecological landscapes they inhabit today in northern British Columbia and southern Alaska. So many reasons why they simply might have slipped out of being noticed, or had they disappeared or declined before major Euro-American presence. Anyhow, open question as it stands. But this is another David Madsen map depicting the grizzly bear situation uh, circa 1800 in the Western United States, lower 48, showing state by state estimated populations based on various modeling um, uh, techniques, as well as the potential density of grizzlies in these Western states. And as you can see, Oregon, Matson estimated might have supported more than 4,000 grizzly bears in 1800, which kind of puts it along with like Idaho and Wyoming and Colorado into this sort of secondary tier of in terms of grizzly abundance in the lower 48, with Montana and California being the leaders in terms of grizzly numbers. And some of the estimates for California grizzly population, historically speaking, are closer to 10,000 or so. But you can see in most of Oregon, I would extend this out more to the southwestern coast at least. But you can see that the majority of the state was grizzly country, and so it was a good place to be a bear. More Madsen maps, quickly summarizing the sort of decline of the grizzly bear in the lower 48 on the heels of Euro-American settlement. These four maps show grizzly distribution and estimated numbers between 1800 and 1960. You can see quite a red retreat and decline. This 1910 map in the lower left gives you some indication of maybe where the final grizzly bears in Oregon in the early 20th century, namely sort of southwestern Oregon and northeast Oregon, which does indeed jibe with historical accounts. And then by 1960, gone. And this is a photo of from the Jerry Gildemeister archives of some northeast Oregon hides taken in the Joseph vicinity. So really quickly, a few anecdotes from Western Oregon, which used to be much of it grizzly country. I'm sure some of you are familiar with David Douglas, the sort of pioneer botanist explorer. When he did in the fall of 1826, he did a expedition in quest of the sugar pine. He had seen the cones of the sugar pine, the really amazingly long cones, and wanted to see the tree himself, and went up the Willamette Valley into the Umpqua drainage and recorded a number of observations, both direct and indirect, including a member of his party was attacked by a grizzly in the vicinity of Albany, of today's Albany, Oregon. He noted signs of grizzly, of bear feeding on wasp nests and ripe madrone fruits. Good chance they were grizzly. That was grizzly sign. And then he ended up himself actually shooting a cub and a female grizzly in the vicinity of. He killed the cub and shot the sow near where Roseburg is today. So just an indication of likely in those interior valleys and the foothills in Western Oregon, what significant grizzly habitat it was. Here's another of my masterpieces of graphic design, but an image that sort of evokes how the Willamette Valley itself, the most populated part of Oregon, was grizzly country. To what degree, to what density we're talking about, we don't know. But and this is a historical account from ultimately the mid 1800s, suggesting that yes, indeed, grizzlies were found um, among the oak savannas and oak woodlands and dry and wet prairie in the Willamette Valley. Um, and actually, this sort of reference to French prairie is notable because that was the site of the early the Shampooey meetings among early Willamette Valley settlers that helped hash out an early version of an Oregon state constitution, but were partly convened to establish bounties on carnivores that were depredating livestock, including bears. So interesting to think of the Willamette Valley as grizzly country. So we certainly don't think of that today, but Willamette Valley, that sort of oak savanna, oak woodland habitat, very reminiscent of, and also southwestern Oregon's analogous habitats. A lot of parallels um, with California landscapes, and the history of the California grizzly is quite well documented. Um, and grizzlies there were killed off by the late 1920s, it seems. But while they were there, many Euro-American records concerning them. And one of the more notable things about California grizzlies, at least if you believe historical accounts, were their great size in some cases. Given the huge physical variability of the brown bear, where you can have quite small brown bears in leaner habitats such as Arctic tundra or the Tibetan plateau or interior continental mountain ranges. They can be a few 100 pounds compared to brown uh, active food systems, including in areas where they might have access to fish runs, like in southern Alaska and Kamchatka. So it's not necessarily surprising that there might have been, given California is such a varied state, and certainly had some incredibly high quality brown bear country, that you might have had some very large bears. And here are some examples. On the right, you have a painting of Samson, a grizzly captured in the Northern Sierra that was said to weigh 1,500-ish pounds. I take that with a little bit of a grain of. There's a photograph of Monarch, who was captured in Southern California in the San Gabriel Mountains in the late 1800s, and when he died, he was weighed at a little over 1,100 pounds. Had a bit of a captive diet, but anyhow, it suggests that in some systems, California grizzlies could get quite large, and given the parallels with, say, southwestern Oregon ecosystems, uh, quite possible that Oregon bears got big too. The This is one of the best known Oregon, certainly probably the best known, was a bear named Reelfoot, killed in southwestern Oregon, known to range in that area and also northwestern California. Also, registered well over 1,000 pounds. Very much associated with Pilot Rock country. So a reminder here, yes, we probably did have some pretty big bears, especially in these really productive food systems in Oregon. In the interest of time, I'm going to hurry ahead here. Just a reminder that also that we have lots of Euro-American grizzly place names in Oregon, including Grizzly Peak here in southwestern Oregon, reflective of their presence on the landscape and their obviously great sort of power in the human imagination. The majority are in southwestern Oregon, followed by northeast Oregon, which again reflects that sort of those regions of the state being the kind of final holdouts, as far as we know, of the bear. Grizzly Creek, Wallowas, Again, Southern Cascades, Siskiyou Crest, the Klamaths being important late refuges for grizzly bears. Also, Northeast Oregon. Here's another picture from the Jerry Gildemeister archives, showing some grizzly hides from the Billy Meadows vicinity from northeastern Wallowa County. Definitely a lot of hides from that vicinity in terms of some of the later grizzly records in the state. Some more shots. These are unique, to just like Reelfoot, who was, as you saw in a few slides back, was mounted in a taxidermy display. Some of the few photographs we have of Oregon bears. Some indication that in some parts of North America, Western North America, grizzlies found some final refuge uh, from human persecution by being able to exploit whitebark pines, which are in some parts of grizzly range in North America are a very important food source. Likely were used in Oregon. To what degree don't we don't know for sure, but say in the Wallowa Mountains, where where the last documented grizzlies were of Oregon were noted. Wallowas have a lot of whitebark pine savannas and forests in the high country. Given how remote and rugged that those sorts of habitats tend to be, in a lot of places that probably took grizzlies out of direct conflict with people, but not in all places. And in the Wallowas, there was a lot of sheep herding going on in the late 1800s into the 1900s, and a lot of that went down in sort of high elevation, montane, subalpine meadows, where if there were grizzlies using white barks as a food source, they probably easily would have come into contact with sheep herders who understandably didn't appreciate them in the vicinity of their flocks. So might not have been the sort of refuge that in some parts of the West supported grizzlies into the 20th century. Here are some just dates for some of the last documented grizzlies in Oregon. Long story short, basically the 1930s is when we have the last firm reports of bears in the state, with the last ones documented, to my knowledge, in the sort of Minam River country in the northwestern Wallowas in the late 1930s. So that's sort of where we set the end date for the Oregon grizzly. That's the sort of snapshot history of where bears were and when. It's interesting to consider the grizzlies were doing on that landscape, and I'll sort of move through this as quickly as I can. And if we want to circle back in the Q&A at any point, we certainly can. Long story short, again, grizzlies are very opportunistic, versatile omnivores. Oregon is a very diverse state in terms of ecological landscapes and habitats, and the grizzly, like few other large mammals, is an animal that really embraces the full spectrum of the landscape and is following sort of phenological rhythms, seeking out high quality food sources throughout its active season, spring through fall mainly. And as a really, notable, it's not a specialized herbivore. It doesn't have the physiology of a specialized herbivore, so it's kind of has to exploit a wide variety of food sources, certain ones being more prized than others, and that varies across that huge historical range of grizzlies in North America. We can sort of guess that in Oregon, probably most grizzlies populations had sort of a fruit mast, in other words, tree seeds and nuts, and and fish-based subsistence system. Um, but because those are all very high quality foods, especially mast and fish. But other food sources likely also utilize, again, whitebark pine and even bison. Um, I'll breeze through these. Most brown bear populations are primarily herbivorous, or plants are providing the bulk of their diet, and that and because again grizzlies don't they have a carnivore's gut, they don't have a specialized, they're not terribly efficient at digesting plant matter. That means they seek out certain kinds of plants, certain plant parts, and plants at certain stages of growth. And that helps dictate where they're going on the landscape, seeking out new growth, um, uh, roots, bulbs, and other underground plant organs that have a lot of stored energy, um, and fresh, succulent new shoots and leaves and stems that are higher in protein and less fibrous. So again, we're talking, in Oregon, these are all pictures from Oregon, so they're probable plant grizzly plant foods, from biscuit root and yampa and sweet Sicilian clovers to cow parsnip, elkweed, angelica, fireweed, just a real botanical bonanza that again helped direct bears on the landscape. Fruits, hugely important bear food, especially in North America, especially west of the Continental Divide. We just have in many places a great diversity, as in Oregon, great diversity of fruiting shrubs. So huckleberries, everybody loves huckleberries. Bears, grizzlies, absolutely. Um, Tuck into that, choke cherries, service berries, manzanita fruits. So that would be more of a typically, again, a mid high summer into early fall food source that really, again, bears were keen into. This is a quote from California, a historical quote, just suggesting the sort of damage a bear, not damage, but bears could be pretty heavy handed when they were feeding on, say, a plum thicket, which would be something you might see in southwestern Oregon as well. Uh, Tree mast, tree seeds and nuts, very much so a high quality food in Oregon. That would be primarily oaks, especially Gary oak or Oregon white oak, the acorns, and then whitebark pine. And these are, they have a lot of fat. They're a lot of bang for your buck as a bear, and so during acorn season in the oak groves of Western Oregon, and maybe on that east slope of the Cascades south of the Columbia Gorge, presumably a lot of grizzlies attending to that. Animal protein is also really important for grizzly bears, brown bears. So everything from rodents to this is a picture of a bad picture of a yellow jacket nest torn open by presumably a black bear here in Oregon, but grizzlies fed on and feed on wasps, ants, elk, especially in particularly vulnerable periods. Ungulates are an important source of food for a lot of grizzlies, but a lot of that is carrion, dead meat. So all of that going down in Oregon, presumably. Grizzlies and bison. There were bison in Oregon. Not everybody knows that. Never probably particularly abundant, but a quick mention that those two species have a deep relationship. Fish, anadromous salmon, steelhead, also landlocked, trout, kokanee, hugely productive bear food, high protein, and grizzlies in Oregon were surely taking advantage of the state's historically great fish runs. And also wherever and to what extent grizzlies were on the Oregon coast, we know from historical records in California and certainly modern day research in areas where brown bears are still on the coast. Marine resources very productive and diverse, scavenging beach rack, dead whales in this picture, clams, kelp, dead fish. So also another really rich food source that might have allowed um, coast that allows coastal bears to get big along with salmon. Uh, and again, just thinking about how these different food resources see bears exploiting lots of different landscapes throughout the year. Aspen Grove and imagining Oregon and Oregon habitats as grizzly zones on a seasonal uh, basis, tracking snowmelt to feed on the succulent plant matter that's emerging, wildfire, burns with a lot of forbs and fruiting shrubs, aspen groves, um, again oak thickets, avalanche chutes, moist mountain meadows. It's just interesting, I think, to remember that these landscapes that we might recreate in and hunt in, this was grizzly country not long ago. Denning sites, we know from California, denning deep in chaparral thickets and jungles, up in the subalpine and in high elevation forests, conifer forests that have a lot of snow. Again, different ways that grizzlies were using the Oregon landscape. I'm going to skip over this little Steens Mountain thing for now. Just interesting to think about those grizzlies and that sort of on the margin of the Great Basin, how they were making a living. Um, I'm gonna try to wrap here as quickly as possible with a little talk about the future. This is in the Eastern Willows, looking towards Hell's Canyon. If grizzlies themselves trickle back in to the state, that might be one of the portals. We do have lots of reports of since the 30s of people claiming to see grizzlies, including some very reputable reports, say from the 70s and the 80s, out here in Northeast Oregon. I don't doubt that there are occasional bears that show up. These are pictures to remind us that certainly in Eastern Oregon, a lot of black bears are brown phase or cinnamon phase, so it's quite easy to get them mixed up, completely understandably. If you have a fleeting glimpse of a bear butt or the right lighting, it's again understandable that some of these are probably black bears that have been misidentified, but not all of them. Um, this is the current these are the current recovery zones as recognized, the grizzly bear is threatened species in the lower 48. So we have 6 recovery zones that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service map shows: the North Cascades, the Selkirks, the Cabot Yaak, Northern Continental Divide, Greater Yellowstone, and then the Bitterroot recovery zone, which was declared. I think it was the only one of these 6 zones that was declared without actually having a known population of grizzlies, but it's high quality habitat. It was recognized as important. So again, the Bitterroot, North Cascades are the closest to Oregon. This is a map showing where grizzlies, also Fish and Wildlife, where they may be present. So outside of those recovery zones and outside of the well documented occupied range, which is mainly here in the northern Rockies into northeast, the Columbia Mountains, Greater Yellowstone. And this is a new Fish and Wildlife proposal from last year, sort of maybe somewhat reclassifying bears into one in the lower 40 as one population segment that, as you can see, does not include Oregon. This is where bears, the Fish and Wildlife Service is maybe deeming bear recovery as most likely. Again, I have time, so I'm going to just sort of gesture. There have been numerous reports. I mean, grizzlies. Central Idaho is a major um, linchpin of potential grizzly recovery in the western U.S. And there have been reports. This is a picture of a confirmed grizzly track uh, near Grangeville, Idaho. That's not very far from the Oregon border. So around grizzlies can disperse. Male grizzlies often, on the order of 20 to 40 miles is not uncommon, sometimes much more. So they're moving around, and it's certain if the Bitterroots greater Bitterroot zone is recolonized, that might be a way that grizzlies start trying to trickle back into Oregon. These are some maps of potential habitat, grizzly habitat in western U.S. And as you can see, there's a lot of it that's not currently occupied, but are remnant or portions of the historical range. Again, we can circle back around to that, but I want to let Rob talk. So here's some more resources if you want to dig in. I definitely recommend all grizzly and mostly natural grizzly sites that David Matson had compiled, because there's so much more information on the historical picture of grizzlies in the lower 48. But thanks for listening. And Rob, sorry for running a little over.
No worries. Uh, Let me just quick share my screen again here. Um, can you see my slide?
I
Let me
don't
see.
yet
Let's see. Oh,
see
I pushed
that.
the wrong button. There we go. How about now?
Yeah, I think it's coming online.
Great. Well, thank you. It should just be a picture of
There
you
we
in the
go.
corner and a grizzly bear.
Yep.
Great. Well, thanks so much. Yeah, I'll try to keep this short as well so we can get as much time for question and answers. And we've got a few questions already, but a reminder, you can put them in at any point and we'll just do our best to get to as many as we can. So I spent a fair bit of my career working on wildlife policy, and I'd be remiss not to shout out a recent success, which is as many of you know, we finally passed a sustainable funding source for non-game wildlife conservation in Oregon. So I just wanted to briefly thank everybody who spoke up to make that a reality. And also really great to find common cause with folks I've been at odds with many at many times in my career, and a reminder that even in these polarized and challenging times, we can still make progress together. Speaking of challenging, much of my work on wildlife was focused on wolves. Like wolves, grizzly bears challenge us, but like Molly Beatty, who was the first woman to head the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, she said, "What a country chooses to save is what a country chooses to say about itself." And I like to add that if we can right past wrongs and find space in our hearts and on our landscape for wildlife that challenge us, that says something especially good about us. So I'm not going to talk too long, but I think the Big Bear just gives us a great chance to talk about some of the values of Northeast Oregon and the Blue Mountains. I like to say that this is a landscape of superlatives. We've got the deepest river gorge in North America, the largest intact bunchgrass prairie, and Oregon's most intact assemblage of large native wildlife. We also had the oldest known physical evidence of human presence on the continent. People here coexisted with mastodons, and it's likely some of our roads and trails follow the ancient pathways that they blazed. Over the last 150 years, though, we've done an incredible amount of damage. Sorry, I just got the wrong slide up there. We've done an incredible amount of damage. We dammed rivers, we drained wetlands, and exterminated wildlife. We turned forests into tree farms and valley bottoms into feedlots. We suppressed fires and persecuted indigenous people. And I don't say any of that to villainize anybody. It's just simply what happened. But much of that is continuing today, and the climate and biodiversity crises are not in faraway places like Africa or the Amazon. Oregon recently increased its list of species of highest conservation concern to over 300 animals. And many of us have moved beyond antiquated fears of toothy animals, messy forests, and letting nature run wild. But with only 3% of our state protected as wilderness, there are plenty of landscapes devoid of those things. So I always find it ironic when people say, maybe you should release wolves and grizzlies in Portland if you all love them so much. In addition to ignoring the fact that many of us in rural areas have modern conservation values, if people fear nature, maybe they should move to urban areas rather than the other way around. But I digress. Um, we've been degrading many of these values here for generations, but because of our low population density, strong land use laws, and conservationists like Brock Evans, Tim Lilbo, Karen Coulter, some of the best remaining and biggest remaining conservation opportunities in the lower 48 are right here in Northeast Oregon. And while folks often think of Eastern Oregon as high desert and open pine forest, it's a lot more diverse and complex. From where I'm sitting, I can see Idaho's Seven Devils Mountains, the base of which is Hell's Canyon, full of rattlesnakes and cactus. But if I turn my head just a little, I can see mountainsides full of wet forests with firs and moonworts and mosses. There are actually more forests in the Blue Mountains ecoregion than any other in the state. And those forests provide the furthest south connectivity corridor for many species of wildlife between the Rocky Mountains, the Cascades, and beyond. And while not all wildlife has the endurance of wolves like OR7, his trip from my backyard all the way to California and then back to the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest was instructive, especially in an age of climate change. If you care about seeing resilience in the Cascades, Western Sierra, Western Oregon, or the Sierra, you too should care about this place. And we're extremely lucky that most of these lands are public. In places like Wisconsin, where we grew up, that just isn't the case. And that means that to the extent that they belong to anybody, they belong to all of us equally, not just people like Ethan and I who are lucky enough to live here. And make no mistake, Eastern Oregon is different than the West Side. Nearly all of our political leaders represent a politically conservative majority, and a lot of voices are marginalized out here. But our communities are not a monolith. Many of us hold deeply held conservation values. We love where we live, and we love both its human and non-human communities. And amongst the superlatives, though we have the state's largest wilderness, our protected landscapes are often high elevation rock and ice, and too small and disconnected to provide the refugia our natural systems need to be resilient in these changing times. And unless they're protected, those values remain under threat. And unfortunately, this is the bummer part of the presentation. For years, using terms like greenwashing terms like restoration or resilience or thinning and collaboration, we've seen extractive industries, their allies, and agencies like the Forest Service using a fear of fire, cherry-pick science, and political polarization to push for a return to industrial logging at just a massive scale. These projects usually start with a premise. The answer is logging. Now, what's the question? And then they double down on fire suppression roads and logging. Massive projects are being proposed that target the largest 3% of trees and the last unprotected and unlogged forests. They're fragmenting habitat and in many places converting our most productive wet forests into these dry, fire-prone, depauperate tree farms. And meanwhile, real restoration that addresses real needs goes unaddressed. And in an age of automation and multinational corporations, even if we quadrupled the cut, yes, more dollars would flow to timber executives in places like Lake Oswego and Boise and Toronto, but very few local jobs would be created or maintained. Meanwhile, things like legitimate restoration, recreation infrastructure, home hardening, sustainable agriculture and tourism actually bring and keep dollars into our local communities, and wildlife can be a major part of that. And economists have shown time and time again that there's a direct correlation between protected public lands and the vitality of adjacent rural communities in the Intermountain West. But very soon, we expect to see a proposal to update management plans for three national forests in Northeast Oregon called the Blue Mountain Forest Plan revisions. The Forest Service has been working on this for years now. However, despite some more recent box checking exercises with the public, they've been spending most of that time working with interests aligned with extractive industries. And these plans are going to guide management of our forests for a generation or more. And though only a select few have actually seen the draft, we know what to expect. A plan with almost no enforceable protections for wildlife, water, functioning landscapes, a priority on timber extraction, mining, unsustainable grazing, road building, and other development. But I don't want to leave you on a total bummer note. So I just want to know, we can make a different choice. We can learn from our mistakes. We can keep common species common while welcoming back and recovering native wildlife. Human communities can flourish without harming the landscapes that support our ways of life. And I suspect nearly all of us are feeling overwhelmed these days, regardless of your political affiliations. But I promise your voice still matters, and this administration won't be forever. When I feel hopeless, I like to remember the quote, even if I knew the world would end tomorrow, I'd still plant my apple tree. So please, take care of yourselves, but when you can, please use your voice and know you're not alone. Um, and just, here are a few of the groups working hard to protect forests in Eastern Oregon. Even when I'm short on belief, I can hang on to hope, and I know if we take care of these places, it will be good for us and all the living things that we leave space for. And so when it comes to animals like grizzlies, all we need to do is kill less, protect what we have, and give them a chance. So when you do get an action alert from us in a couple weeks asking you to weigh in on the Blue Mountain Forest Plan revisions, I hope you'll take action. Whether you're a neighbor or stuck in a world of concrete, you have a say. And with that, I'll step aside and we'll see if we can get to some questions. I will ask for your patience though as I work through these, but we'll start with this one for Ethan, which is, was there a reason or hypothesis why grizzly bears were not historically found in the Olympics, or have people just not found evidence?
That's a good question. I'm not aware of or physical evidence for grizzlies in the it's often been sort of pointed as sort of what would seem to be habitat. I know that there are some going back some thousands of years. I believe there's a, a grizzly bone record or maybe even fossil record from Whidbey Island. But the sort of grizzly distribution in the Puget Trough, the Puget Sound tree, and also the Washington coast. The North Cascades and the Cascades. But yes, I don't have brown. It's just black bear. I mean, and there's other notable absences of species historically, like wolverines that, as I understand it, not in the Olympics. A ton of information on that, but yeah, it's a really good question. It's something to dig into.
Thanks. And we have a number of questions about why there are gaps in the map. But I'm going to ask you one other quick one about California. Would the Oregon Grizzlies have been related to or the same as the extirpated California golden bear?
Yeah, I mean the Cal grizzly was often suggested to be its own um, subspecies or going way back species, but modern analysis shows that they are genetically affiliated. I mean, as those range suggest, there was continuous habitat that certainly was linking Oregon and California. So the same bear, speaking, but maybe with some interesting ecotypes or some real variation in size and kind of ecology.
Cool. And I'm getting a couple comments. Your audio is breaking up a little bit. I'm hoping it's working for most people. And what we might try to do is just put some answers in the blog when we post the video as well, if folks are having a problem. But we hope you'll keep sticking with us. We'll answer a few more questions before we wrap it up here because there's some good ones.
Sure.
And a really good broad one is, can you talk about the benefits of grizzlies on the landscape?
Yeah, that is a great question. Uh, Grizzly bears have significance. I mean, they given they have such a wide ranging diet and use so many different parts of the landscape. We know that they're important seed dispersers. They're fruit berries. That adds up to a lot of seed dispersal. And in Oregon, where grizzlies were probably eating a lot of where fruits were a big part of the diet. Some of you may have heard showing um, how spawning streams are their means of transferring that the nutrients energy system into that surely was going on in Oregon. So grizzlies do a lot of digging. I mean, they're maybe they're distinguishing characteristic as compared to other bears are their long foreclaws, and they dig for everything from rodent to roots and bulb. They move a lot of soil, so it can be significant. That's a lot of it's almost a geomorphic effect that bears have. So absolutely, lots of impacts when you have an animal that can. It's a big animal. It packs in a lot of food and it covers a lot of ground. So significant ecological effects, some of which are some, but not all, are mirrored by our black bears. We have, I think, 30,000 ish estimated black bears in Oregon. And there's a lot of dietary overlap between black bears and grizzlies. But one thing black bears don't do as much, not evolved to do so, is that digging, for example. So yeah,
Yeah.
great question and an
Well, and I
interesting
might
topic.
briefly riff off that.
Yeah.
When you think about the fact that grizzlies were here in living memory, there's people alive today who were here when there's no question there were grizzlies still here. Um, and one of the things I've heard a friend of mine and a mentor of mine, Ralph Anderson, who is a wildlife biologist out here in northeastern Oregon, he points out that there's these landscapes, the biscuit scablands on the prairie, that once had bigger populations of things like snakes and amphibians on them. And they're really going away. In fact, they're largely gone in some cases. And his theory on that, and it makes a lot of sense, is that the grizzly bears were constantly going in there and turning over rocks, immense rocks, small rocks, everything in between, constantly keeping that surface changing. And what that meant was there were areas below where small critters could go down and hide from predation. They could find water. They could stay cooler in the heat of the day. But without that happening, and also even again, like indigenous people on the landscape digging for roots in those same landscapes, those rocks are starting to get essentially cemented into place with soil that then grows plants and moss. And so it has really significant effects. And I want to be clear, I think that was a great question. So I'm not calling it an ignorant question. However, I want to quote Aldo Leopold, a fellow cheesehead, who had a quote that to me encapsulates so many things, which is the last word in ignorance is the man who says of an animal or plant, what good is it? If the land mechanism as a whole is good, then every part is good, whether we understand it or not. If the biota in the course of eons has built something we like but do not understand, then who but a fool would discard seemingly useless parts? To keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. It goes on, but I think just that idea of, we ascribe what's good and bad, where if at the end of the day we think that, having a healthy landscape is an important thing, then having all those parts is probably also important. I will get off my soapbox. I will note, though, that there are a lot of comments in here just saying, thank you, Ethan, great comment, or great presentation. There's some people supporting the Chicago Bears and opposing my views on conservation. We'll let those go. But I will say, how about this one? Why do you think that the historical grizzly range didn't include Eastern North America? Oh, no. It appears we have lost Ethan. I'm going to give Ethan just a quick moment to come back. I'll see if there's any questions I can answer, because most of them are really specific for him. Yeah, I think we'll just actually go ahead and call it. I apologize for that awkward ending. But let's see. Yeah, I don't think we're going to be able to get him back. Okay. Well, sorry about that. Well, in any case, I do appreciate everybody being here tonight. Sorry we didn't get to all those questions, of course, but just want to thank you all for joining, and thank you all who actively support our work. Thank you, Ethan, for a great discussion. Hopefully, it won't be our last. And again, I might reach out to Ethan to see if we can get a few more questions answered and include that in the blog that goes along with the video. Please do remember to look out for that a link to the recording in your inbox. It's not too late to buy a raffle ticket, and please be sure to take care of yourselves and your neighbors, and please continue to support groups that fight for your values. And thank you all, and have a wonderful evening.